Welcome back to the Reconcile podcast, where we're confronting cultural lies with hope, discernment, and biblical truth. Today, we have with us a special guest, Emma Waters from the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much for being here with us, Emma. I'm excited to talk about your book, Lead Like Jael, and your upcoming book, Rethinking Fertility. So thank you for coming on the show with us today.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Caitlin.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing right now in life.
Yes, so I am a policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation, but I am also married to my husband who's in seminary full time. And we're expecting our third little girl in about a week or two at the time of this podcast recording. So we're very much in the throes of young parenthood with our girls and enjoying this season of life. But as you noted, outside of the home, I'm also the author of Lead Like Jael. I do a lot of federal and state policy dealing with men and women's health and infertility and the way we think about reproductive technologies and biotechnologies that are emerging. So that's where a lot of my passion projects and work lie outside of that.
Yeah, that sounds exciting. So tell us a little bit more about what it means to be a policy analyst. I'm very interested in this. And I honestly, I mean, I can deduce from what the title is, but I would love to know more about that and for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a great question because it sounds very vague and amorphous in some sense, but very practically speaking, it means that I am both a subject area expertise in the topics that I'm focused on. So I need to understand all of the ongoing research and history and policies around IVF and surrogacy and fertility, men and women's health, emerging biotechnologies, and be able to speak to the technology, but also have the policy background to say, okay, here's what's been tried at the federal and state level. Here's what we could do to address these problems. And so I will write a lot of model legislation or offer technical guidance and expertise for lawmakers or those in the executive who are looking to craft legislative action on these issues. But I also do a lot of public awareness and speaking. So I'll write articles for different outlets explaining a new issue and then pointing them towards practical solutions or speaking at conferences on these topics. And part of the fun of the job is that I have been able to step into a few different realms where I can put on my researcher hat and dive deep into an issue and speak at Harvard for a conference that they're doing. But I can also put on my faith-based hat and speak to a conference of young men and women who are thinking about the importance of marriage and say, this is what the Bible says about the goodness of marriage and the goodness of children. Here's how we should think about it from a biblical worldview. And so there's a certain level of freedom in the job that I currently have where I can put on different hats at different times. But at its heart, being a policy analyst is really just being a total policy nerd and being able to write different solutions to actually practically address an issue. And this is where a lot of the incremental and strategic thought comes in, because it's one thing to say, oh, well, if this is a bad thing, we should just ban it. And maybe that could be ideal in an ideal world, but we are far from living in an ideal world. So really the challenge of a policy analyst is thinking through what are the incremental and politically savvy approaches you can take to go one step in the right direction without affirming something that you don't want, but also realizing you're not going to get everything in every piece of legislation. And so what are the right trade-offs to make at a given time or not? So it's a lot of different layers like that, but a lot of fun at the same time.
Yeah, that sounds very important because what I see from the left often, but I think the right is guilty of this as well, is not all we see is the stated intention of a law or a policy and not necessarily what the actual outcome is, which can sometimes be quite different. So, thank you for sharing all of that. So, tell us a little bit about, Jael is an interesting character. So, when you were getting ready for this first book, what made you think of Jael and use her as this exemplar for your book, Lead Like Jael?
Yes, and it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek title, as you can imagine, a bit provocative, because as I was researching this topic, and this really goes back to my time in college when I was wrestling with questions about marriage and motherhood, and really dealing with a lot of the deep-seated fears that I had about children taking my time, my body, my sense of self, and really ruining everything that I perceived that I had worked for at that point in my life. It was a very unbiblical, ungodly view that I had of children in particular. And so as I started doing a deep dive into what the Bible actually says about marriage and motherhood and the goodness of children, I came across a number of different commentaries, but particularly those around Jael were interesting to me because, on the one hand, you have feminist theologians who hail Jael as this great feminist icon. She throws off the patriarchy, takes control of the situation, she defeats the man. She's everything that we want to see among women today. And in doing so, they really downplay and don't even mention marriage and the home and children. But as I read her story more closely, I realized that it was in no way a feminist, she was no way a feminist icon, but there was actually something far more interesting happening underneath the surface that I thought really spoke to where a lot of women are today. And namely, it's that Jael was actually present in her home and invested in the domestic duties of her day, which would have included setting up and taking down her tent, that actually gave her the skills that she needed to defeat the enemy when he came knocking on her door. So the tent peg and the mallet that she used were actually domestic feminine tools. They weren't tools of war, they weren't masculine tools. And so it really struck me that this was a woman who, because she was faithful to the calling God placed on her life, because she embraced her femininity, she was actually equipped to fight evil. And she wasn't running out to battle like all of the other men, right? She was fighting in a distinctly feminine way that really struck me as an area where we have really failed to equip women, because we say, well, to be strong, you have to look like a man, or you have to act like a man, or pursue a career like a man. And in subtle ways, this has even crept into the church in the way that we think about strength, in such ways that, again, I think just fail to actually give women the tools they need to thrive as women. And Jael's story really struck me as a fun and interesting example of what that can look like, that would catch a lot of readers off guard, whether they find themselves more liberal or more conservative.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about your story. You mentioned being in college and having these distorted views, if you will, of what it meant to be a woman when you, or if you would be giving up too much to maybe put that first in life. So, how did you go from that to where you are today, just in your personal journey?
Yeah, it took a really big wake up call. So I had met and fallen madly in love with my now husband. And very quickly, we were talking about marriage and future plans. And I was fully on board with the idea of marriage. That sounded great to me. But then all of a sudden, the C word came up, or children.
Yeah.
And I had this complete meltdown that really surprised even me in my response to it, where I was the oldest of a homeschooling family. I had been raised in a very conservative Christian home and community, babysat all the time, was very pro life, and yet was terrified of becoming a mother anytime soon. And so I was having these conversations with my then boyfriend saying, well, what if we just don't have kids until we're 30? Plenty of women don't have kids till they're 30. That's great. And we're about 21 at the time. And so he was like, well, that seems a little odd and unbiblical to get married and then intentionally delay having children for 9 years. And I was like, okay. And really just found myself with this deep and maybe even unstated fear that somehow having children would mean the end of everything I had been trained for, everything that I had worked for. And as I was winning valedictorian, preparing to go off to DC, it felt like, on the one hand, this entire world was being opened to me. And at the same time, the prospect of children was threatening to shut the whole thing down. It was very extreme binary thinking, one way or the other. And a lot of it doesn't make total sense, except to say that when fear and an unbiblical worldview about children take hold, you really aren't making a lot of sense, I think, in some ways. And yet at the same time, I think this is something that a lot of women have wrestled with, and a lot of women do wrestle with. And so all of that to say, on a total whim, broke up with my then boyfriend and basically said, I just can't do this. I don't know what to make sense of children. I can't think through this right now. I just need to continue on. And very quickly regretted that decision. But at that point, the damage was done, the trust was broken, and I realized that I needed to take time to actually figure out what the Bible says about these things. And I had a mentor of mine at the time who came to me and she said, well, Emma, either the Bible's right that children are a blessing, or you're right that children will ruin your life. but you can't both be right. And so you should probably figure out where you stand on this issue. And it really struck me that even as a practicing and faithful Christian, I had fallen so far outside of what the Bible says about the goodness of children. And that was a really big problem where I was in the wrong. I didn't understand, and I needed to actually submit myself to God's word and be able to experience the fullness of what he had. And so that kicked off really a 3-month intensive time of studying God's word, talking to mentors, and trying to make sense of all of these questions, both theological and practical, that ultimately led, thankfully, to us getting back together. But there's this very on the nose moment in the midst of this where I was going into my senior year, applying for all of my spring internships, which is like the big moment of the internships you get your spring semester are the internships that set you up for your job when you graduate. And so those matter a lot more than some of the previous ones you had. And so I'd applied to all of these different internships and no one was getting back to me. And I was like, well, this is really weird. Like I'm a pretty competitive candidate. I would have expected someone to reach out. Well, at the same time, my I guess ex-boyfriend and I had set a time to meet, to talk, and hopefully get back together, which I absolutely wanted at that point. And then one internship reached out and they were like, this is great. We love your application. You can come, but you have to attend this one training, this one weekend in December. And it was the same weekend that we had already set aside to meet to talk about getting back together. And it was this rather humorous example of God being like, well, do you want to prioritize your career or do you want to prioritize marriage and family and these things that you say you want? And while this isn't, a litmus test to apply to every situation, it really spoke to me as like a moment of decision. So I said no to the internship, the only internship I had been offered at that point, to keep the date that we had set. And thankfully we did. We got back together. I was able to use that as an example of, no, I'm very serious about actually wanting to rethink the way that we approach family first, and then all other endeavors after that. And then in the generosity and kindness of the Lord, 2 days after that, I got internship offers from two of my top locations. And it really struck me in that moment, per the C.S. Lewis quote, that when you put first things first, God honors and blesses the second, not because he has to, not because he owes you, but because he's a good and generous God who desires to give good gifts to his children. And even when we feel like we are sacrificing and giving away the most quote unquote important thing to us, it's actually when we're putting first things first, prioritizing the things the Lord has given us in that season, that we reap the greatest blessings. And so that was really the foundation for the book Lead Like Jael, and what inspired me to later write it was that experience, and then seeing so many other women walking through that and feeling like there wasn't a strong biblically based book that was really meeting women where they are, to recognize that your ambitions and passions are good and those are gifts God has given you, and yet at the same time shouldn't replace or come before these higher callings of marriage and motherhood when the Lord puts those in front of you as well.
Yes, absolutely. When I saw your Instagram handle and your description that said, basically not trad wife, not boss babe, somewhere in between, I so resonated with that. And I do believe there is this growing conversation, as we were talking about before we hit record, online especially, but these things play out into our culture and they seep into everything. So there's been obviously feminism, which is an error, but you can often, when you respond to these errors, especially something as dark as feminism, you can overcorrect. That's always a possibility. And it can become very emotional to enter into that conversation, because I've made a post before where I thought I was being balanced, and I said, okay, hold on a second. I'm seeing some things online that are almost degrading women a little bit and saying, well, if you do anything outside of the home, now you're in sin. We're drawing these really hard lines where the Bible doesn't necessarily draw these hard lines. And so I made a post about it, and then I was called a feminist and unfollowed by a couple people because, which was hilarious to me, because I am mostly a stay-at-home mom, and then I just do some of these things on the side that I feel like God has placed on my heart. But so when I saw that title, I really resonated with that. So I'd love for you to speak to that a little bit more practically. How did that play out for you? So you meet with him, you get back together, you decide you're going to prioritize family and children, but you also have this flourishing and incredible career that you're working on. So, can you give us some really practical steps that you took moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you're so right. I hear from so many women that they're part of this silent but rising majority of neither girl boss, neither trad wife, but just trying to live a normal, faithful life as wise, godly women. And I think that there's so much untapped potential there for really guiding the next generation of Christian women forward in this space in ways that, yeah, just are untapped, I think, in a lot of ways. So, practically, the way that we've thought about it is really going back to Genesis 2 and 3. You see this model outlined in the names given to Adam and Eve. And so Adam is given two names, which is Adam from the earth, speaking of his role as the provider. And then Adam renames himself in light of Eve as the Ish to the Ishasha, the husband to the wife. So Adam is the protector of his wife. And then Eve is actually given three names in Genesis 2 and 3. The first is she is called the Azer Kenegdo, or the battle mate, or the helpmate to Adam. This idea of strength coming to aid strength in the mission God has called them to. The second is she's named Ishasha, the wife, by Adam. And then God calls her Eve, the mother of all living, in Genesis 3. And so in these names, you see two primary callings and orientations, particularly for men and women who are married, right, and pursuing, open to life or having kids. The first is that the husband is primarily called to provide for the family and protect the family, to be the husband to them. And the wife is primarily called to be the battle mate, the aid to the husband, and also the one who nurtures and raises children. But what is so, I think, smart about the Bible, and it just is just what the Bible says, is that, or I guess what the Bible doesn't say, is that the Bible never gives you hard lines beyond that. It never says, therefore, women can never go out into the world and work or have a podcast or have conversations or write books. And it never says that men shouldn't play with their children and be invested in the life of the home. In fact, Ephesians says that men are the head of the household, so they should be intimately invested in what is happening there. And I think, to your point, we've seen this over correction where all of a sudden it's like men must be out in the world and women must be at home, and they have these two distinct spheres that they're existing in a way that the Bible actually never presents it. It gives us priorities that we are to be faithful to first and foremost, and then gives a lot of leeway in how we spend those secondary interests and means. And so this is why I really focus on the role of seasons in a woman's life, recognizing that different seasons will ask and demand different things of her. And so what faithfulness looks like in one season may look very different in another. So the way we've done it is we got married right after college. We were living in DC, where my husband was working at a church. I was working for the Heritage Foundation, where I still am. And we, I think after 4 or 5 months, got pregnant with our first child. And so I was working full time, and then we had our daughter. And with my husband being in seminary, we've sort of had like a balanced work where I have continued working full time, especially while he's finishing seminary, to offset both the financial and health insurance costs. But I also was very bullish about the boundaries that we would set, which is namely that I still wanted to be primarily present with my daughter. And from research that we had read with Erica Komisar on being there and other daycare studies, we knew that we didn't want to pursue full-time daycare or really much out of the home daycare with strangers, especially I think over 10 hours a week. That's when children really start to suffer the consequences of it. And so I thankfully have an organization that I work for that is incredibly supportive of moms and of families. And so the moment my daughter was born, I stopped going into the office full time and really have pursued flexible work hours, which means lots of very early mornings and lots of very strategic nap times. And then we flex the final like 2 hours a day, essentially. And any childcare that we have has always primarily been home based and either with a close friend or a family member that's stepping in. And so whether it's a cousin or one of our moms or my sister who's now living with us, we've been really intentional in trying to fill our home with people that we want to influence our daughters, not just sending them out into a daycare full time. Because I think that would actually be not being faithful to the call of primarily like raising and crafting your children. And I know different women have different situations, and it's like there's no one size fits all for this conversation. But those are some of the very practical ways we've thought about it, which is essentially any job that I would have needs to be a job that will allow me to put my kids first and work around my family, not ask my family to sacrifice for my job. And we've been in a flexible season because my husband has been a full time student, which is, of course, more flexible than just a 40-hour a week job. So as that shifts, I'll also shift accordingly. And so it's just been very much like holding these things loosely in our hands. And so with every season, we can reassess what is actually good for our family and then make work decisions accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like you guys have figured out a really good balance. And I think we kind of glossed over this, but I think it is so cool. I've never heard that the word is, did you say battle mate? Could you tell
Yeah,
us a little bit more about that? And
yes.
I
I
just think that is such an interesting way to put that. I've never thought about it like that before.
Yes. Okay. And so this came from Peter Lightheart, and he explored it in his book called The Glory of Man. And if there's any book that you order today, order Peter Lightheart's The Glory of Man. It's on Genesis 1 through 3, and it is simply exceptional on so many levels. But he talks a lot about the phrase helpmate in Genesis 2, or the Azer Kenegdo, which he says can accurately be translated battle mate. And it's speaking of the one like opposite Adam. So, like Adam in his humanity, and yet opposite him, they complement the completion of Adam as man and woman. And what it's really underscoring is that everywhere else that phrase is used, the Azer Kenegdo, it is used throughout the Bible in military context to refer to the stronger party coming to aid the weaker party in a given instance. So, God as the Azer Kenegdo helping Israel, or David and his mighty men as the Azer Kenegdo helping those who were in need. And so he and I, by extension, in the book, really explore the idea of what it means for a wife to be the battle mate, the strategic aid to her husband. Because I think this counters a lot of the niche online trad wife discourse you can see, where you'll hear things like, well, my wife just does whatever I say, or my wife believes whatever I say, or my wife votes for whoever I say she should vote for because she doesn't need to think for herself. She can just trust me. And I mean, Lord willing, you can trust your husband, but that is not a call to check your brain at the door, if you will, because in fact, every single story of women, faithful, godly women we see in the Bible, these are women who are incredibly smart and shrewd and resourceful and strategic women who are able to be a true aid to their husband. And I think the practical question is if you are raising daughters, if you are a woman, what kind of daughter are you raising? What kind of woman do you want to be? Do you want to be someone who can be the strategic advisor to their husband, a trusted counsel? Well, that's going to require a lot of time and thought and effort put into cultivating those skills. That's not just something you're born with, right? And that's actually the vision that the Bible gives for women. And that's the vision we should be calling other women to as well. And this is the case in Jael and Ruth and Deborah and the Proverbs 31 woman and Esther. And in each of those stories, I think it's so telling that, again, they're primarily using these very feminine strengths, but at the same time are no less essential for the battle at hand and no less essential for the victory that is won. But they're complementing the men in their life rather than competing with them or seeking to replace them. And in doing so, are fully fulfilling that like opposite battle mate vision that we see in Genesis. Because you need a complement, but a complement who's able to meet strength upon strength. So, one example of this that I really love is in the book of Ruth. There are 4 chapters, but there are 3 times you see this phrase hail used. Hail refers to, in most cases, a very wise woman, or not a wise woman, just a wise strategic warrior, someone who's successful in battle. It's, again, similar militaristic language. Well, it's first used to describe Boaz as a strong and mighty man. It's then used to describe Ruth as a strong and mighty woman. And then in the final chapter of the book, it's used to describe their marriage and their union together, that the two of them, strength meeting strength, then have a marriage that is fruitful and effective and strategic in what it does, which I think is just a really beautiful vision of the kinds of marriage and the kinds of men and women we want to raise.
Yeah. Yeah, and in your book, going back to that for a second, you give some points for women. Can you expound upon those a little bit and just, if you had to give like a couple of main takeaways from your book, Lead Like Jael, and those character traits that you talk about, could you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I primarily talk about 7 different principles or virtues, not as an exhaustive list, but 7 that I think are particularly under attack today that need to be recovered by women. So the first is the call to discernment, of knowing good from evil, of how to apply God's word to rightly discern cultural situations. The second is shrewdness, which is not manipulation, it's not lying for selfish gain, but it's being smart in a given moment to know how to navigate it well. Then there's resourcefulness. And I describe resourcefulness particularly as a strength cultivated in and through the home. So this is where you see Jael or Mary, the Mother of God, or the woman of Thebes using distinctly feminine means to be resourceful to fight to overcome the enemy. Then there is the principle of hospitality. And this is something that is present throughout all of the Bible through men and women, but particularly women like Esther, who use hospitality in a very strategic way to actually defeat evil and invite those men around her to really step up to the plate, not by maybe approaching them with the most demanding, outlandish, and brash behavior, but in inviting them to the table where we can actually come to commune with one another, commune before God, and seek true reconciliation. And then I dive into the principles of marriage as battle mates, then motherhood as an extension of oneself into the world, and then finally women as wise counselors and negotiators. And so this is looking at women in that later stage of life as matriarchs, such as Deborah or Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, or Sarah, Abraham's wife, who really set the tone for what it looks like to be a godly woman, but particularly a godly woman who then in turn offers counsel and wisdom to those around her, be it her husband, the city, or younger women who are coming after her. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. So, and then what would you say to maybe a woman that, is home full time right now, and maybe her husband is a little bit unsure about her taking something on outside of the home, children? What could she do to encourage that? Like, how can she make sure that, let's say, even though I think sometimes what I get wrapped up in my head and what I did in the early years was that, well, in order to prioritize my home and my children, that means that I can't spend time outside of the home. I don't want to be spending more time on this thing. So maybe give some advice for a woman that's wrestling with those things, and then maybe how to speak with her husband if she has these desires and these other goals to ensure him or reassure him that the priority is still going to be the home and her children.
Yeah, and I think these are obviously like very specific situations. And so what I would say is first and foremost to, yeah, one, think through what are those particular interests that you do have. I think it's very easy for us to think, well, if we have this interest, then the way it must be manifested is doing XYZ job outside the home. And maybe it is some sort of job, but maybe there's actually a lot of ways that you can pursue it that's more contract work model or even just flexible online engagement that doesn't require you to have a formal job or time outside the home. There's more opportunities for women than ever before, I think, to very strategically and creatively craft these spaces where they can pursue their passions, do something that they enjoy, but it doesn't have to look like getting a full time job or even working officially for an organization. So I think first and foremost, it would just be assessing what is it that you're actually interested in? What are the ways that you can manifest it? Two would be praying for wisdom. God gives wisdom generously to all who ask, and thinking through, okay, if this is something the Lord is putting before me, just because the interest and passion is percolating now doesn't mean that now is the time God is calling me to ask to act upon it. So maybe it's a call to begin reading about the topic and educating yourself and having conversations, but it's not something the Lord is telling you to do now. A good example of this is Katie Faust, who leads the organization Them Before Us, which is one of the foremost organizations fighting for children's rights in America and across the world. Well, she started blogging about this issue when she still had young children at home, and she was deeply passionate about it. She wrote about it, but she knew that in that season of life with young children as a pastor's wife, God wasn't calling her to start an organization. He wasn't calling her to get a full time job, but that she was there to equip herself and engage with the issue. And then as her children got older, entered high school and entered college and are now leaving the home, she's leading an organization she founded based on those principles. But just because she had the passion 15, 20 years ago doesn't mean that God was asking her to jump all in at that time, but rather be faithful to each of those seasons until the right time came. The third thing after that is, yes, to talk to your husband to explore these ideas, but ultimately to trust his wisdom and discernment and his timing on this, because God, I think, has put husbands as the head of the home and given them a wisdom and a responsibility to govern the home well. And so, in cases of a truly godly husband, right, he is looking out for your best interest as his wife, and he wants to see you flourish and thrive. And so I think approaching it as a team, right? You're on the same team as battle mates together, and thinking through this rather than coming to the table bullishly pushing for a particular solution or outcome, rather than actually having those conversations and trusting his lead and where he really feels like the Lord is taking it. And then the
Yeah.
final thing is just an honest assessment of the cost, because everything you say yes to, you're saying no elsewhere. So I know a ton of women who make the most of their nap times, or like me, get up really early in the mornings or stay up late some nights a week to write, to do podcasts, to do media. And so what the world is seeing is like, wow, this is a really accomplished woman who works really hard and has so much that she's doing, much like your podcast, right? And then on the inside, you're like, yes, it's actually 5 a.m. and my kids are sleeping in the room next to me and I'm writing this article.
Right.
And so the reality maybe is actually very different than what it appears, but it's a way that
Hmm.
you can do it without actually taking time away from your kids or taking much time away from your kids, right? So you're able to do it, but you're doing it in a way that actually works around the family schedule. Yeah, so I think those are just like some of the practical things that I would say and be
Yeah.
thinking through. And really, at the heart of it all is fighting against the idol that somehow career defines you, or your public output is more important than the private discipleship and nurture that you are doing in the home. Because the moment we start feeling that tension, that's where the enemy is speaking lies to us, and the word of God is not the one reigning over us. Especially if we feel like this is an identity crisis, that we are now less than as a woman, or not pursuing our quote full selves. And that's where we really go astray. And the moment you start having those thoughts, that's when you just need to check yourself and be like, okay, I am no longer actually like living in a biblical worldview. I'm now buying into the lies of the world about my success and identity as a woman.
Yeah, I think the internet is so interesting. It has given us these opportunities that maybe we wouldn't have had 100 years ago to, as a woman, to be able to work in this way from home, like you said, having the ability to put it out there to the world in a way that we didn't used to have. But I also think sometimes, especially when I first started this, that it can be very sneaky that the goal is to have a large platform and reach as many people as possible. But somebody that I read about that was very impactful for me was Susanna Wesley, and the mother of Charles and John Wesley, and who of course started the Methodist Church and led many, many people to Christ and had this huge impact on the world. And I read her story and her life. You if you just read it from that perspective and you judged it by today's standards of, well, what's your kingdom work, or what's your impact, and is it big enough or reaching enough people? And I just think about her because her legacy that she left with raising those children. And I mean, I don't know if you ever read about her life, but it was not an easy life. She walked through a lot of hardship, lost several children, had many times where her husband was not even present in the home, and they were very poor. But she poured into those children. She poured into her community, even. She would read these sermons that people questioned whether or not she should be reading them because she was a woman, and they're like, oh, you're trying to preach. But she was just reading the sermons to her community members that maybe couldn't make it to church, or whatever the case may be. And she had such a huge impact. So I think we do have to be careful sometimes of, how we see this now that we do have this incredible ability to reach more people, but making sure that we keep it in perspective that the online platform, the longer I do this, the online platform becomes less and less important to me. And how am I impacting those around me as well? Not to say that online is a bad thing, but just keeping that balance in mind, and what are my motivations?
Oh, yeah, this
Um,
is such a good point. My husband
yeah.
quotes or references her story all the time
Oh,
as like,
really?
yes, I mean, rightly so, right? Because like,
Yeah.
yeah, her her true faithfulness in the home raised up two of the greatest men in recent Christian history. And
Hmm.
how many times have women actually foregone that great glory, that great service in the home in pursuit of something that ultimately maybe was a lesser good, because they didn't trust the Lord and didn't trust that like our faithfulness in the home is the, I think, the greatest indicator of what the Lord can and will do through us.
Yeah. And well, and also what blew my mind is I watched The Great Awakening recently, and maybe everyone knew this, but their impact on even someone like George Whitfield, who who basically, helped with the Great Awakening or started the Great Awakening. I haven't read as much about him yet, but I just found that so interesting that you can draw that back to Susanna Wesley and her faithfulness in her home. But yeah, you said something earlier I want to hit on quickly too. You mentioned men that it can become very polarizing where it says, okay, women only at home, men only outside the home. And I think we can miss things both ways. So not only can a woman miss opportunities or ways that she can pour into the community or gospel or kingdom work because she thinks, well, this is the only sphere that I can exist. This is the only thing that I can do. But a man can also miss the opportunity to pour into his household. So what do you think that looks like for a man to be involved in his household well?
Great question. I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. The first is that when the Bible describes the man as the head of the household, it's emphasizing his role as the spiritual head. So he is ultimately responsible for the life and faith of his wife and of his children. And so this means that my husband leads us in morning prayer many mornings a week, not every morning, but multiple mornings a week, reading the Bible, and really setting the example for what faithful, godly living looks like. He also will do Bible time at night with our girls before they go to sleep in a little devotion that he has, because ultimately, a lot of studies have shown that the faith of the fathers is what is ultimately passed down to the children. So obviously, there are cases of Susanna Wesley where God blesses faithfulness, but generally speaking, children do take on the faith they see modeled by their father in the home. And so it's really important to us that our girls are seeing my husband pray and confess sin. Maybe not in front of them, but as a corporate practice, and read the Bible and really talk about the Lord's goodness. That's one of the really big ways. The second is that we both wholeheartedly believe that the home is the life source of the family, and the home should be the central place where all other strengths and efforts and passions and work flow from, not just this leisurely landing pad that we come back to at the end of the day. So it means that my husband really cares about the inner workings of the home. He wants to not only hear about our day, but he wants to know, okay, how can we have better schedules or have better ways of leading the family? What are the sorts of habits that we want to have as a family, either the rules or discipline, or even just the kind of culture that we're setting, a culture where we really encourage siblings to love one another, to play, hospitality, things like that. Like he hasn't just delegated that to me and is like, well, this is your sphere, figure it out. But he's actually actively involved in helping craft that with me and then uphold and really reflect those values as well, right? He doesn't just come home and kick up his feet, but he comes home and is actively invested in making all of those things happen. And then, practically also does cleaning and helps like manage the home in some of those ways too. It's not just like a one woman endeavor to have a strong, flourishing family. And then I think beyond that, yeah, I think those are the main things. But I think beyond that, it's the realization that the home ultimately it falls to, I think it's ultimately, what am I trying to say? I think ultimately husbands will answer for the homes that they lead. And so while women may be the ones primarily at home, and that is actually ideal on so many levels from social studies onwards, it's ultimately men who are going to stand before the Lord and say, okay, this is what I was faithful over. And wives will stand for what they have done and children for what they've done. But at the same time, husbands are not exempt from the calling and the testimony of the home. And in fact, that's
Yeah.
ultimately pointed to them. And so I think just really taking that seriously, and not, yeah. One example that comes to mind often is I was raised in these evangelical homeschool circles, and part of it's just the nature of the dynamic. But you had a lot of families that I observed growing up where The husband was working a really demanding full time job. The wife was the homeschool mom. She was at home full time with all the kids. And it actually created this sort of perverse incentive structure where it's not that these women would have ever said, I'm a boss babe, I'm an egalitarian, I'm the head of the home. They never would have said that. But they effectively functioned that way, where husbands were like, well, I don't know what's going on in the home, so I'll just defer to you on all of these different questions. Or you handle discipline, I'm too busy at work, or I've just come home after a long day, I don't have time to deal with this. Can you take care of it? And the result is that you ended up with homes where women really were functioning sort of as like the sole head of household, single mom when it came to these decisions about discipline and discipleship and what children should or shouldn't be doing throughout the day. And husbands were just totally tapped out, either because they lacked the time or the energy or the interest in the work they were doing outside the home. And so husband was the breadwinner, but wife was everything else. And they seem to have very different lives in a way that, even in these Christian circles with the best of intentions, seems like a really unhealthy balance to me.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's such a good point. My husband feels this at times, and we've been working towards and are still working towards adjusting things with his work where he can be more involved. And, that's a whole other topic that we could dive into, but we don't have time today of just the history behind cities. I've heard pastors talk about that and kind of development and how, again, like there can be good things to that, but then there are typically consequences as well to this idea of the man leaving the home full time. Like that's kind of relatively new as well. I mean, in historically speaking, men may not have been inside the home, but they were working generally, maybe raising animals or gardening or whatever it is, or there was a family business. And so that idea is kind of new as well, I think.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah. We're all about recovering a home economy where husbands and wives are actually working together in the industry of the home, even amid our very modern culture where, yes, most jobs are this sort of you leave your home to go to this other place to do your job. And this like segregation from the family unit that I think is very modern and ahistorical in that sense, where husbands and wives were typically working together pre industrial revolution. The children were a part of it as well. And to the degree that that can be recovered today, I think that's a fantastic calling for every Christian family to pursue.
Yeah, for sure. I've definitely seen that in my kids where I, you know, if they don't have a job to do, things pretty much go haywire very quickly. They need work to be doing, and not just saying that in like we don't ever play. I'm not, we try to have a balance. But if I just say like, okay, go play all day, I just want you to like go find something to do, go play, entertain yourself, whatever. They just don't do well with that. But I mean, honestly, starting young with them, they love to do chores. This is hilarious, but my son, he's 8, and I taught him to clean the toilet. And I know I probably should have done it sooner, but I did it last week. He said, "This is so much fun. I'm going to clean the toilet every day."
Yes.
What in the world is going on? Okay, great. You do that. But yeah, there's something about that where like work, there is a curse to it, obviously, after the fall, but it is a good thing. It is a good thing for us. And I think it's good for us to be doing together. But I did have one other listener question that I wanted to ask and see if you have any advice for this person. This is obviously another kind of specific scenario, but I do think I didn't have an example of being at home. My mom and my dad got pregnant very young with me. They struggled when I was younger, and so I went to school full time. My mom worked full time, sometimes being making more than my dad did and supporting him through school or what have you. So I didn't really have a good example of that, and I think that's a lot of our generation. And so when I first came home, I struggled a little bit. I don't know what I expected exactly, but I didn't have that example. So I just struggled to find a good rhythm, and none of us were really thriving. So if you could speak to maybe a woman where, you know, she is home full time, which is the ideal, but also not really thriving and not sure where to go from there.
Yes, this is a great question. And something that's always struck me is that Rebecca Merkel, who wrote Eve in Exile, another fantastic book, makes this point where she talks about how if the 1950s were so ideal, then why did the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s come from it? Maybe it's something in that that was broken, that was not as it should have been. And she really makes the case, and I would echo her on this, that in the same way that women in the 20th century fought very hard to, I think wrongly, leave the home in order to pursue more meaning outside the home. What they ultimately missed was not that the home, or what they ultimately missed was that they equated the home with this sort of like frustrating, meaningless endeavor. And then they looked outside the home for the solution, when in reality, they had the opportunity then in the 1950s, 1960s to actually dive deeper and ask, what is the true purpose of the home? What does true order look like beyond just perfectly polished silver? What am I actually trying to accomplish through this time that I've been given to invest in my children, invest in my home? And many women in that generation failed. They said, well, we should just replace it with work and all go outside the home to work. And the consequences of that, I think, have been dire. So I think we in this generation now have a similar task before us, which is to say, okay, we have all of these cultural influences which devalue motherhood and marriage and devalue the home, and say your ultimate happiness is found outside of that. Well, what does it actually look like to dive deeper into the purpose and goodness of the home? And so there's that sense of like figuring out really what is the mission and culture that you want to craft in your home. Because as Proverbs says, where there is no vision, the people perish. And so if you're feeling frustrated or like things are not working, then I would say, okay, well, what is the clear vision? And then the second thing is order and wonder and productivity are actually very good things. But these are not skills that most women have been raised with, of how to be productive and organized in the home in a way that's truly life giving. And so this is where I would really recommend a mix of things, from just good productivity standards of like, okay, having a home that's life giving means having a home that's clean, generally speaking, right? Kids are crazy and like there's different measures of cleanliness. Or how much am I practicing hospitality? Am I making time to cook nourishing homemade meals? How do I structure my day in a way that actually allows for these things to happen and enjoy my time with my kids? And I think just very practically think about the order that you want to craft there. And that order is not contrary to meaningful time, but actually frees you up to have those moments that matter with your children and with your family. And to your point, inviting your children into the work of the home in really crucial ways. Like my 3.5-year-old loves to water plants with me, and she can't quite do it on her own. But I'm already seeing a future like you, where I'm like, oh, this is what's really awesome about having kids, is that you can actually do things to help the home run. And so I think to those women, a lot of it just comes down to, if you feel like you're overwhelmed and that you're failing and that nothing's really working out, maybe it is a spiritual question that you need to dive into. And maybe it's just a practical one where you should find a few women in your community that seem like they're doing pretty well at crafting an orderly and meaningful home, and just sit down with them and say, okay, tell me how you do it practically. When do you wake up? What are the schedules you're implementing? Like, just talk me through the details. And one really great trilogy that does this is called the Summa Domestica, which is a play on words from the Summa Theologica, written by Aquinas. But in one of her books, I think it's the third one in the series, she walks through in like excruciating detail all of these questions, including like, how do you wake up early in the morning? And then she talks about, well, what does it mean to wake up early? What's your motivation? But she goes in so much detail as to even talk about vitamins you could take to help your body wake up sooner. And so I would honestly just recommend looking at the Summa Domestica and reading some of her advice, because it's so incredibly practical and I think helpful for women trying to craft and respond to some of these central questions that they have about making the home productive and orderly, but also life-giving, and a culture that people actually want to be a part of.
Yeah, for sure. And it can be overwhelming. So just from my own experience too, to add for the listeners is, take it one thing at a time. Okay, well, I can't seem to get laundry done. How can I figure out a system for this? Don't try to, bite off everything at once, so to speak. And so, yeah, just take it one day at a time. But honestly, what I was convicted of, and it's not exactly popular for me to say this, but that's okay. I do that a lot. I'm just going to speak the truth. But I thought about the fact, okay, well, what if my husband was negligent with his work? Obviously that would need to be addressed, right? In a loving way, a respectful way, but that would need to be addressed. Well, okay, what is my work? Part of my work is my home. And so how, obviously, like you said, seasons, when you have a newborn, you don't need to be beating yourself up that you didn't get the dishes done every single night, but maybe you need to enlist help for a season, but then maybe after that, step into, okay, how can I figure out a good system to get these things done because I want to honor my home and the work that God has put before me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so good. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's transition. We don't have a lot of time left, so I want to talk about your upcoming book, Rethinking Fertility. So, you actually have a whole podcast called Rethinking Fertility, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, tell us about that and how did you become, invested in this and so that you have a whole show about it. And then now, obviously, you're writing a book. So, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this is where a lot of my policy work comes in. But in 2020 onwards, as COVID was shutting down and technology was really mediating every human interaction that we were having through Zoom calls and remote work and Snapchat and so on, it struck me that technology was radically reshaping the way that we thought about what it means to be human. And in particular, the way that we conceptualize the parent child relationship. And this is where I stumbled into a lot of research around infertility, the rise of reproductive technologies, and the fact that we can't judge a given technology just by what it technically does, but we actually need to understand the way the technology is impacting how we see the world and how we see one another. And that's the far more consequential impact beyond anything the technology is doing. Hence, your use of social media or digital technologies, which have wreaked havoc on younger women and their self esteem and anxiety and depression and self harm temptations, even some of the gender ideology and sexual orientation debates that we've seen. And so I just really became obsessed, I guess maybe would be the right word, with this whole area of study and looking into, these reproductive technologies. And so I've been researching and covering these issues through policy work for a number of years, but had the opportunity to start a podcast called Rethinking Fertility, where from an evangelical Christian worldview, we're diving into all of these questions of men and women's health and infertility and the use of technology and how all of that's playing together in the modern world, and why we as Christians can't afford to put our head in the sand and simply ignore the issue until we're personally dealing with it, and why we actually need to be very proactive in our approach.
Hmm.
So I have a Substack that goes along with it. And then I am writing a book for Crossway that will come out sometime in the next year or two, once the manuscript is turned in, which is specifically diving into this issue and saying, evangelicals, you have been the backbone of the pro-life movement as we know it. And yet at the same time, we've been inconsistent with our pro-life values when it comes to applying it to the fertility industry and to our use of IVF and surrogacy, which creates surplus numbers of human embryos, genetically tests them, and destroys them at very high rates. And so it's really a call to the church and to Christians in America to say that if you truly believe in this pro-life mission, it can't stop at the issue of abortion. It must continue into the issue of infertility. And we must be very courageous and firm and compassionate voices for the unborn, including those that are embryonic lives sitting in a petri dish somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I know when we went to advocate for an equal protection bill here in Tennessee, just earlier this year, and one of the most common pushbacks we got. I'm in Tennessee, so we have a super Republican majority here, and most of them call themselves pro-life. But what I found interesting was the most common pushback that we got was the IVF industry, that this could impact that, which I found so interesting because, again, like you said, why are we not applying this, what we state to be our beliefs in our actual policies is that from the moment of conception, this is a human being and that they should be protected. But for some reason, when it comes to IVF and the surrogacy industries, we throw that out the window. So I found that very interesting. But could you tell us a little bit more about, I mean, I didn't even know we were in a fertility crisis. So can you kind of set the stage for me? How bad is it? And then what do you think? I know you talk a lot about this, I can't remember what you called it, but basically like natural courses to take to correct infertility, right?
Yes.
So tell us a little bit, set the stage for us, like how bad is it? And then what do you see as a better option than IVF and surrogacy?
Yeah. So, fertility rates are declining across the world, and among developed nations, every single nation is below replacement rate. And replacement rate just speaks to women on average having 2.1 children to replace she and her partner, if you will. But most nations, the United States included, is well below that replacement rate and is having fewer and fewer children every year. So as of 2024, I think the US was at 1.6 children on average per woman. And that's even higher than a lot of European nations. And so while there's a lot of impacts socially with our military, with GDP, felt impacts in our national health, there's a much deeper question that I'm interested in, which is if happy and hopeful people tend to have babies, then what does it say about the spiritual state of Americans that they're no longer interested in having children, in getting married, and dating? This is actually speaking to a far deeper crisis and fragmentation in our relationships between men and women and our understanding of this good calling to be fruitful and multiply and to be open to life in our family. And of course, you can't have this conversation without thinking about abortion and the improper use of birth control and our reproductive technologies, because notably, the United States was above replacement rate until 1973, when the Supreme Court erroneously decided there was a constitutional right to abortion. We have never recovered from that, and we've been below replacement rate ever since then. And that's before you even get into the overuse of birth control and IVF and digital technologies and social media and all of these other technological factors. And of course, cost in the economy, etc. But all that to say, in my work in particular, I had been covering IVF for a number of years as a policy issue, but it was still a rather niche topic that most people didn't know anything about unless they had personally gone through an IVF journey or walked very closely with someone who had. And this all changed in 2024 with the Alabama Supreme Court decision on human embryos as persons in particular instances. While the timing of the case, of course, came out right in the middle of the presidential election, and both parties, Republicans and Democrats alike, pro-life and pro-choice alike, rushed to say that they were the pro-parent, pro-IVF party. And so we spent a couple of months of just nonstop work writing and speaking and counseling lawmakers and the public about what is IVF actually? Why is IVF not pro-life and the way that it's being sold to you? And how should we really be thinking about it? And it struck me very early on that even if we got every policy protection we wanted for human embryos and their parents undergoing IVF, that would ultimately fail to answer the bigger question. And the bigger question is not, do we want more IVF or do we want less IVF? The bigger question is, how do we help couples who are struggling with infertility have the children they desire? Because the reality is that not only are birth rates declining, but rates of infertility are increasing in the United States over the last 2 decades alone. So it's not just that we're hearing more about the problem, but we are actually that there's more of the problem to deal with in the first place. And so this is where I started building out the political platform for restorative reproductive medicine, which recognizes that infertility is not a disease in and of itself, but is the symptom of underlying reproductive health conditions in both the man and the woman's body, meaning that infertility is not just a woman's issue, but it's actually something that affects both partners. And where there's a diagnosis of infertility, there tend to be 4 or more underlying conditions at play. So there's no one size fits all solution, and there's no single cause, even when a couple is dealing with infertility. In most cases, it's actually a very nuanced diagnosis that requires careful diagnostic work to address it. And so this field of restorative reproductive medicine has been around really since the 1980s through natural procreative technology, neo-fertility, and related medical approaches that really make up the world of RRM itself. But that was that's been the thing that we've really focused on in recent years, because it turns out people are actually hungry for a true diagnosis for their infertility and real steps to treat their infertility, such that they can restore their natural ability to conceive and have children rather than just bypassing their body through IVF. And the last thing I'll say is that of the studies that have come out, RRM success rates are comparable to, if not higher than, IVF success rates. So this isn't a matter of choosing the better option versus the more ethical option, but it turns out the more ethical option may also just be the more successful option and helping couples, pursue that gift of having children.
Yes, I saw that you posted on Instagram about 5 million patients, and 70 to 85% of them have started IVF by 9 months. So is that by 9 months of infertility
That's
being
9 months from their infertility diagnosis.
okay. And then you said up to 78% skipped the basic workup first. So briefly tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, so this study came out in July of this year, looking at 5 million patient claims and then narrowing it down to those with a diagnosis of infertility, and then relying on the recommended clinical guidelines from the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. They assessed how many patients at fertility clinics were actually getting the recommended diagnostic workup to assess the cause of infertility before moving on to IVF. And this has been a very big point of contention where the fertility industry says, well, RRM is fake medicine. And also, we're already doing everything RRM says. So we don't need more RRM. And of course, neither of those are actually true. Either it's fake medicine or you're doing it, but it can't both be true. And in fact, it's not fake medicine. And sadly, many fertility clinics aren't actually doing the diagnostic workups they are even recommended to do before starting IVF. So this study found that upon receiving a diagnosis of infertility, there were many couples who started IVF before they had ever had the full, like the basic workup of infertility tests for men and women. And by 9 months, as you said, 70 to 85% of those couples who had been diagnosed with infertility had started IVF. And yet, anywhere between 13% and 78% had not received all of the diagnostic workups that were recommended to even assess why are you struggling with infertility in the first place, which means that we are selling couples an expensive, ethically compromised workaround in their sincere desire for a child and failing to actually do basic medical assessments beforehand to see if there's actually a way we can restore your natural fertility without relying on IVF. And so, study is a real bombshell because I think it provides the concrete language for the feeling that a lot of parents have where they go through IVF and then they look back and say, no one ever actually tested these things. No one actually took the time to assess why I was struggling with infertility. And I think there's a lot of frustration among a lot of families who have undergone IVF where they haven't had that care. And then this study comes out and actually validates it and says, yeah, you weren't alone. This is actually a really big problem in the industry. And it's something that needs to be course corrected in an extreme way, because ultimately we're letting these couples down and we're putting human lives on the line to do it.
Yeah, and I cannot help but imagine that this has to come down to money, which so many things in our society does, but it's very expensive to go through IVF treatment. And I'm sure that it's a lot less expensive to go through the more natural means.
Yeah, and this is a big problem. Over one third of IVF clinics are owned by private equity firms. Private equity firms buy and resell highly lucrative, quick turnaround cash cow businesses, essentially, which means that if private equity firms are heavily invested in and interested in fertility clinics, they A, recognize there's a lot of money to be made, and B, studies have shown that private equity owned clinics are more likely to push costly, invasive add on procedures to the IVF process that may or may not actually have any sort of clinical benefit to overall success rates. And notably, over 70% of all IVF cycles are happening at those clinics. So they're also more likely to push IVF, more IVF sooner. And so it's not just a sneaking suspicion. There's a lot of studies that have been shown that say, yeah, it's actually very financially beneficial to push IVF. And whereas IVF for a single cycle can cost anywhere between $12,000 and $30,000, for RRM care, even with surgical interventions, as is sometimes needed, the utmost a couple pays is about $17,000. But there's an even bigger distinction, which is that with restorative reproductive medicine, once you address the problem, you don't have to restart the process every time to have a second or third child. You may need to do supplemental care, but you're not restarting an expensive cycle. It's the work has been done. Whereas with IVF, studies show that it takes about 2 to 3 cycles before achieving the live birth of a child, which means $12,000 to $30,000 every single time. And then on top of that, if you want to have child number 2, 3, or beyond, then you have to restart that entire process. So it's incredibly expensive and cost prohibitive for a lot of parents. And so maybe they succeed in having one child, but then the cost of going back to have another may actually be more than they can afford or really prioritize at that time. And it's simply not the case with RRM, to say the least.
Yeah, and I think that, it's important to say here too that again, all these things can become very emotional. I think doctors or people that work in the IVF industry or people that have gone through this process to have their child, first and foremost, your child is still made in the image of God. I'm glad they're here. But that doesn't mean that we continue to perpetuate this process that, like you said, is not only dangerous for children and women. I've had Jennifer Law on the show and Josh Wood from Them Before Us. There's lots of, I think, women that don't even understand the side effects that can come from IVF drugs and surrogacy drugs. So I wanted to say about, doctors even as well, that they could be sensitive about us talking about this issue like, oh, well, we just want to help people have babies. And so I totally understand that. But I think what happens, Dr. Frank Turek talks about this some on his show. He might have written about it, but I can't remember. He talks about this idea that so often we're motivated by incentive and not the truth. And so I think it becomes very easy when you do have these lucrative businesses that I don't think doctors are doing this just to intentionally, cause harm. I believe the majority of them think that they're doing the right thing. But when there's this much money involved, it's so easy for the motivation to become the incentive rather than the truth.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's spot on. Many doctors are just as much captive to the industry and the business model that's been established, and to the insurance reimbursement models, crucially, as they are anything else. So I think most doctors do have the best of intentions, but they themselves are working in a system that is actively opposed to this kind of root cause care. And in many cases, they haven't been taught anything else. If you go to medical school, even knowledge about fertility and fertility awareness based care, studies have shown doesn't increase over the course of their medical residency. So, in many cases, doctors are not being taught this information, and the business models they're entering into are certainly not making space for it. And so, while we're not letting doctors off the hook per se, at the same time, I think there are many cases where they have also been failed by the fertility industry and the fertility system that we're a part of. And they, just as much as their patients, actually lack good training and awareness about these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much again for coming on, Emma. I almost called you JL. That's hilarious. But yeah, tell us where we can find that book and then when your next book will be out, Rethinking Fertility, and just where people can find you and support your work.
Yes, of course. Okay, so Lead Like Jael is available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere you order your books. And then my platform of Rethinking Fertility, we have rethinkingfertility.com, which has links to all of our books, but also a ton of practical resources for couples who are thinking about infertility, reproductive health conditions, birth control, particularly from a Christian worldview. Then I have my podcast, Rethinking Fertility, that can be found anywhere you listen or watch your platforms, such as YouTube. And then we have our Substack, Rethinking Fertility, where I publish once or twice a week, diving into all of these issues and more with research, with theology, with a biblical foundation. And really love engaging with listeners. So highly recommend finding me on Substack. And then, of course, for any of my policy work and advocacy, Emma Waters at the Heritage Foundation is where you can find a lot of my writings and work there.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Emma, for everything that you're working on. I hope everybody goes out and buys your book and subscribes to your podcast and your Substack. And we will link all of that in the show notes. So hopefully we'll talk again soon.
That sounds great. Thanks so much for having me today.
Thank you.